In the harsh and unforgiving landscape of 1887 Arizona Territory, a woman named Sarah McKenna stood at the edge of a canyon watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of blood orange and dying amber. She held her daughter's hand so tightly that the child whimpered in pain, but Sarah could not let go. Not because of love alone, but because in this moment, that small hand represented the only thing worth living for in a world that had taken everything else. The dust of the trail clung to her tattered dress, and her face bore the marks of suffering that only the Wild West could deliver. What she was about to do would shock even the most hardened settlers in the territory. She would offer herself completely to a man she had never met before, surrendering every shred of dignity and independence that she possessed. But, as she walked down that canyon slope toward the outlaw camp hidden in the rocks below, she was not running away from something. She was running toward the only chance her 7-year-old daughter Sarah and would have to survive another winter. This is the story of a mother's impossible choice, a story that would be whispered around campfires for generations, a story about what a woman will sacrifice when love becomes more powerful than shame, and when survival demands the unthinkable. Rebecca Thomas had been born on the Kansas plains, the daughter of a preacher and a woman whose hands were constantly busy with the work of keeping a family alive. Her childhood was marked by prayer and practicality, by faith and hard work, by the belief that if you lived righteously, God would provide. But the world had a way of teaching harsh lessons to those who believed in such things. She grew up believing in a world where good things happened to good people, where a woman's virtue was her most valuable possession, where marriage was sacred and forever. At 19 years old, she married a man named Thomas McKenna, a trail rider from Tennessee who spoke with a smooth accent and promised her a life of adventure in the territories. For 5 years, they built something that resembled happiness in the small town of Prescott, Arizona. They had their daughter, Sarah Ann, born on a cold December night when snow covered the mountains. Thomas worked as a scout for the military, bringing home money that they stretched to cover their modest needs. Rebecca planted a garden. She made friends with the other wives at the fort. She attended church every Sunday. She believed that her life would continue this way forever, building slowly into something secure and comfortable. But forever came to an end on a warm afternoon in April 1887, when 2 uniformed officers knocked on the door of the small cabin where Rebecca lived with her daughter. Thomas McKenna had been killed in a riding accident on the San Pedro River, they said. Their words came from far away, as if spoken through water. The details were confused. It did not matter. What mattered was that Thomas was gone, and with him went the regular income that had kept their lives stable. What mattered was that Rebecca now owned nothing but the small cabin, a horse that was aging rapidly, and the clothes on her back. What mattered was that she had a 7-year-old daughter who needed food and shelter and safety, 3 things that the territory did not easily provide to women alone. The months following Thomas's death moved with the slow weight of grief mixed with desperation. Rebecca took in washing from the soldiers at the fort, spending hours with her hands in hot water, scrubbing blood and sweat from military uniforms. The pay was barely enough to keep them fed. She sold her jewelry piece by piece. She sold furniture. She even took a brief job cooking for a boarding house, but the work was brutal and the hours left no time for Sarah Ann. She came home each night to find her daughter alone, locked inside the cabin, having to use the chamber pot rather than risk going outside where she might be taken. Rebecca would hold her child and whisper promises that everything would be all right, even though she no longer believed these promises herself. It was at this moment, in the darkest corner of her desperation, that she heard about Jacob Wilcox. The men who came and went from the boarding house where Rebecca worked spoke about Wilcox in hushed tones. He was a man who had broken his way out of a territorial prison in New Mexico. He had robbed 3 stages and 2 banks. He had killed at least 2 men, maybe more. He was dangerous and violent and cruel, the kind of man that mothers warned their daughters about. He was also, according to the whispers she heard while serving coffee and clearing plates, a man who had money. A great deal of money. Money he had stolen and hidden away in the canyons east of Prescott, where he now lived with a small group of men who owed him their loyalty. Money that he spent on whiskey and gambling and whatever else men like him spent money on in their hidden camps. But, more importantly, Wilcox had recently lost his wife to illness. She had been a Mexican woman from Sonora who had borne him 2 children before tuberculosis took her into the ground. The men said that Wilcox had been nearly destroyed by her death. He had become even more brutal and unpredictable than before. He had taken to bringing women to his camp for brief periods, women he paid small amounts of money to. They did not speak about what happened in that camp, but everyone understood. And then, as suddenly as he had taken them, he would send them away, often with bruises on their faces and haunted expressions in their eyes. Rebecca knew, from the moment she heard these stories, what she was going to do. She fought against this knowledge like a person fighting against drowning. She prayed in the small room of her cabin while Sarah and slept. She imagined other options, other paths, other solutions. But none existed. She had been alone for 8 months, and, in that time, she had watched her daughter grow thinner and quieter. The light in Sarah Ann's eyes, which had once been bright and full of childhood joy, had become dim and careful. The child was developing the habit of walking on the edges of rooms, making herself smaller, as if she understood that they did not have the resources to take up much space in the world. The morning Rebecca decided to find Jacob Wilcox, she walked into the small room where Sarah Ann was sleeping on a narrow bed, a quilt that had belonged to her grandmother spread across her thin form. Rebecca looked at her daughter's face, still rounded with childhood, still carrying the traces of the girl she had been before everything changed. She looked at her daughter's hands, small and delicate, resting against the quilt. She thought about the coming winter. She thought about the fact that she could not afford to heat the cabin properly. She thought about what happened to children who did not get enough food, who lived in cold houses, who were not safe and warm and cared for. And she made a choice that would alter the course of both their lives. She put on the nicest dress she still owned, a blue calico that Thomas had bought her years ago. She braided her hair carefully. She looked at herself in the small mirror they owned and barely recognized the woman looking back. She was 31 years old but could have passed for 45. The hardship of the past year had carved lines into her face. But she could still see traces of the pretty girl she had been, and she would use those traces like a weapon. The trek to the canyon where Wilcox's men camped took 2 days. Rebecca left Sarah Ann in the care of a neighbor woman, promising to return within a week. She packed bread and cheese and traveled on horseback, following directions she had carefully gathered through quiet conversations with people she barely knew. The landscape around her changed as she moved east, becoming more wild and less tamed. The mountains grew higher. The vegetation grew sparse. She saw no other people and realized that she was becoming increasingly isolated with each mile she traveled. But she did not turn back. When she finally reached the canyon, it was near sunset. 3 men appeared from the rocks, their hands near their guns, their expressions suspicious. She raised her hand slowly and told them she was looking for Jacob Wilcox. She told them her name. She told them what she wanted. She did not cry or beg or perform any emotional display. She simply stated the facts of her situation with the straightforward honesty of a woman who had already lost almost everything and thus had little to fear anymore. Jacob Wilcox emerged from the largest tent as the sun was sinking behind the western ridge. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a scarred face and eyes the color of cold stone. He had been a handsome man once, before violence and cruelty had rewritten the features he was born with. He looked at Rebecca for a long time without speaking. Then, he asked her why she was there, and she told him the truth. Part 1. The sacrifice. Rebecca stood in the canyon camp of Jacob Wilcox and felt the last pieces of her old self being stripped away like the clothes on her back would soon be stripped away. The sun had finished its descent, and the men had built a fire that cast strange dancing shadows across the canyon walls. The other men, there were 5 of them, she counted carefully, watched her with expressions that ranged from curiosity to contempt. She understood what they thought she was, and she let them think it because it did not matter anymore what anyone thought of her. What mattered was that Jacob Wilcox was listening to her, and what she had to say might be the difference between Sarah and surviving the winter and starving to death in the cold. She told him that she had a daughter, 7 years old, who needed shelter and food and a safe place to live. She told him that she had nothing else to offer except her own labor and her own body. She told him that she would cook for him and clean for him and share his bed whenever he wished. She told him that she would obey any command he gave her without question or complaint. She told him that all she asked in return was that her daughter be brought to the canyon once the weather began to turn cold, that the child be given adequate food and warmth and basic care. She did not ask for kindness. She did not ask for gentleness. She asked only for the bare necessities of survival. Jacob Wilcox listened to this entire speech without interrupting. When she had finished, he walked around her, studying her like a man examining a horse he might purchase. He asked her if she understood what she was offering. He asked her if she was a woman of her word. He asked her if she would regret this decision and attempt to flee or turn against him. Rebecca answered each question with simple honesty. She told him that she understood perfectly. She told him that she was a woman of her word or had been, and would be again if he gave her reason. She told him that she would not regret this decision because the only thing she could regret was allowing her daughter to suffer. Something shifted in Jacob Wilcox's expression. It was not sympathy, exactly. It was more like recognition, the kind of recognition that occurs when one person sees something true and raw in another person. He turned to his men and told them that Rebecca would be staying. He assigned one of them to build her a tent and to bring her clothing more suitable to the camp. Then, he walked away into the darkness, leaving her standing by the fire with her heart pounding so hard she thought her ribs might crack. The night that followed was not the night Rebecca had expected. Jacob Wilcox did not come to her tent. Instead, one of his men, a younger fellow named Samuel with kind eyes that seemed out of place in this harsh setting, brought her a blanket and a plate of beans and showed her where the water was. He spoke to her gently, telling her that the boss had many things on his mind and that she should not assume anything about what might happen between her and Mr. Wilcox until he decided to make it clear. This kindness, small though it was, nearly broke her. She had been steeling herself for the worst, and the worst had not come, and somehow that made her want to cry in a way she had not cried since the news of Thomas's death. She lay awake most of the night in that tent, listening to the sounds of the canyon around her. The wind through the rocks. The small animals moving in the darkness. The occasional sound of the men talking quietly by the fire. She thought about Sarah and Sathan Prescott with the neighbor woman, probably sleeping without fear, probably not even understanding that her mother had just made a deal that would change the shape of their lives forever. She thought about what would happen when Sarah Ann arrived at this camp, when her daughter saw the rough men and the harsh landscape and understood, slowly and painfully, that this was now her home. She thought about whether she had made the right choice or the wrong choice, but quickly stopped this line of thinking because there could be no such evaluation. She had made the only choice available to her. In the days that followed, Rebecca discovered that her new life in the canyon had its own strange rhythms. She was given tasks to perform. She cooked for the men, learning quickly what kinds of food they liked and what they rejected. She was given old clothes that had belonged to Wilcox's Mexican wife, and she altered them to fit her frame. She was assigned a section of the camp where she could attend to the women's work, washing clothes in the cold stream that ran through the canyon, mending shirts, preparing vegetables that had been purchased during supply runs to nearby towns. The other men, besides Samuel, largely ignored her, and she was grateful for this. Jacob Wilcox himself remained a strange figure in her new existence. He did not come to her tent. Instead, he would sometimes appear while she was working and watch her for minutes at a time without speaking. He would observe her hanging wet clothes on a line, or stirring a pot of stew, or sitting by the fire in the evening, and his expression would be unreadable. Once, he asked her if she was happy. The question was so strange that she did not know how to answer it. She told him honestly that happiness was not what she was pursuing. She was pursuing survival. He seemed satisfied with this answer, though she could not be certain. 2 weeks after Rebecca arrived at the canyon, Samuel came to her while she was washing clothes and told her that a supply wagon would be heading toward Prescott in 2 days. He said that Mr. Wilcox had authorized the sending of money, if she had someone who could receive it. Rebecca understood what this meant immediately. She could send money to the neighbor woman who was caring for Sarah Ann. The amount was generous, more than she could have earned in months of washing clothes. She understood, in a way that made her chest ache with a complicated mixture of emotions, that Jacob Wilcox was already beginning to honor his side of the bargain. The first time Jacob Wilcox came to her tent, It was on a night when the canyon was particularly cold and the wind howled through the rocks like a living thing. Rebecca heard his footsteps approaching and sat up on her bedroll, her heart immediately beginning to race. But she had prepared herself for this. She had known it was coming. She pushed down her fear and tried to think of it as simply another task, another requirement of the bargain she had made. She had sold herself in every way a woman could be sold. She might as well accept what came with that sale. But what came was not what she expected. Jacob Wilcox entered the tent and stood for a moment, silhouetted against the firelight outside. Then, he sat down on the edge of her bedroll, and he began to speak. He told her about his wife, the Mexican woman who had died. He told her that she had been a good woman, kind and brave and full of laughter. He told her that he had loved her, in his way, though he was not a good man and could not be the kind of husband she deserved. He told her that her death had broken something inside him that he was not sure could ever be repaired. He told her that when Rebecca had ridden into his camp with her honest voice and her desperate eyes, for the first time since his wife's death, he had felt a kind of recognition. Not attraction, though that too existed. But recognition of another person who had been broken by loss and had somehow kept moving forward anyway. Then, he lay down beside her, not on top of her but next to her, and he held her while they both lay in the darkness. They did not have intercourse that night. Instead, Jacob Wilcox simply held Rebecca while she lay stiffly beside him, gradually learning to breathe normally, gradually understanding that this man, who had done terrible things and lived a terrible life, was also simply a lonely person who needed to be held in the darkness. She realized that she too had needed this, and she began to cry silently while he held her, tears running down her face and soaking into the rough blanket that covered them both. Part 2, The Impossible Love. As autumn turned into winter, the canyon camp of Jacob Wilcox transformed in subtle but unmistakable ways. The tents were upgraded to more permanent structures, with wooden frames and insulation made from cloth and straw. A larger communal area was built, with a roof for protection from rain and snow. New supplies arrived regularly from towns where Wilcox's men had contacts. But more important than these physical changes was the shift in the relationships within the camp, and, most notably, the relationship between Rebecca and Jacob Wilcox himself. What had begun as a straightforward business arrangement, her body and labor in exchange for the security of her daughter, had gradually transformed into something neither of them had expected or perhaps even wanted. After that first night when Jacob had simply held her and told her about his wife, he continued to come to her tent, and, on those nights, they did not have a physical relationship in the way that Rebecca had prepared herself for. Instead, they talked. For hours, they talked. Jacob told her about his childhood in Tennessee, about a father who had been cruel and a mother who had died when he was young. He told her about the first time he had killed a man, and how the experience had changed something fundamental in him. He told her about the years before he had met his Mexican wife, when he had been consumed by rage and the need for vengeance against a world that had hurt him. Rebecca, in turn, found herself sharing things she had not expected to share. She told him about her childhood on the Kansas plains, about her father the preacher and the expectations he had placed on her to be virtuous and pure. She told him about her marriage to Thomas, about the way she had built a life based on the belief that if she was good enough and worked hard enough, everything would turn out well. She told him about the moment she realized that the world did not operate according to the rules she had believed in, that goodness did not guarantee safety, and that sometimes survival required the surrender of all the things you thought made you a decent person. Jacob listened to these confessions, and he held her when she cried, and he asked her questions that showed he was truly hearing what she said and not simply waiting for his turn to speak. By December, when the snow began to fall on the canyon and the wind became truly bitter, they had developed a relationship that could not be easily categorized. They were lovers, but not in any traditional sense. They were business partners, but the business had become something more than either of them had anticipated. They were two broken people who had found in each other a kind of wholeness that neither believed they would ever experience again. It was Jacob who, without consulting her in advance, sent word to Prescott that Sarah Ann should be brought to the canyon as soon as possible. Rebecca heard about this decision from Samuel, who came to her with a strange expression on his face, as if he was not sure whether to congratulate her or offer his condolences. The winter was approaching rapidly now, and the roads would soon become impassable.
If Sarah Ann was to come, it had to be soon. Rebecca experienced a complicated rush of emotions when she heard this news. She was overjoyed at the prospect of being reunited with her daughter, but she was also terrified. Sarah Ann had spent the last months in Prescott, in a relatively normal home environment, attending the local school when the neighbor woman could manage it, being treated like a normal child. Now her daughter was about to be brought into the camp of an outlaw gang, to live in the wilderness with her mother's lover, to have her entire world rewritten once again. Rebecca asked Jacob why he had made this decision. He told her simply that Sarah Ann was her daughter and belonged with her. He told her that he had resources enough to keep the child safe and comfortable. He told her that he had no intention of becoming a father to the girl, but that he would ensure she was never hungry or cold or afraid. And then, he asked Rebecca a question that changed everything between them. He asked her if she would consider staying with him, not because of an agreement they had made, but because she wanted to. He asked her if she could believe that he had changed, or at least that he was trying to change, because of his love for her. Rebecca did not answer immediately. Instead, she asked him what it meant to stay. He told her that if she wished, and if she could somehow overlook all the terrible things he had done and the terrible person he had been, he would like her to consider the possibility of becoming his wife. Not in a church with witnesses and a preacher, but in every way that mattered. His partner in this life, his lover, the mother of his household, the woman who would share his bed and his life for whatever years remained to them. Sarah Ann arrived at the canyon on a cold December morning, and Rebecca stood at the entrance watching her daughter emerge from the covered wagon that had brought her from Prescott. The child was pale and thin, and her eyes were wide and cautious as she looked around at the canyon and the camp and the strange men who moved through it. Rebecca ran to her daughter and held her so tightly that the child gasped for breath. "Mama?" Sarah Ann asked, her voice small and confused. "Mama, where are we?" "This is our home now," Rebecca told her daughter, and she had to stop speaking because her voice had broken. "This is where we're going to live, and we're safe here. Do you understand? We're safe." Sarah Ann did not seem to understand, but she clung to her mother, and that was enough for now. Over the following weeks, as winter settled fully into the canyon and snow covered the rocks and the paths, Sarah Ann slowly adjusted to her new life. Jacob kept his word about the child. She was never cold. She was always fed well. Samuel became a kind of informal guardian, teaching her to ride the older horses and to navigate the pathways of the canyon. Jacob himself remained distant from her at first, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, a different kind of relationship began to form. He began to appear when she was having meals, and he would sit across from her and watch her eat with an expression that was difficult to read. He began to ask her questions about what she had learned and what she liked to do. He began to teach her about the plants and animals of the canyon, pointing out which plants could be eaten and which were poisonous, how to read the signs of weather in the clouds above. Sarah Ann, with the resilience of children, began to accept this new man as a fixture of her world. She did not call him father, and Rebecca was careful never to suggest that she should. But the child came to trust him in a cautious way, and she was comfortable in his presence. Rebecca watched all of this unfold, and she made her decision. She told Jacob that she would marry him, not according to the laws of the territory or the laws of the church, but according to the laws of their own hearts. Samuel acted as a witness, and on a clear cold day in January, as snow fell softly around them, Rebecca and Jacob exchanged vows that no one else in that canyon had ever expected to hear. Part 3, The Cost of Redemption. The years that followed were strange and difficult and, in their own way, beautiful. Rebecca and Jacob built a life together that was unlike anything either of them had imagined when they were younger and believed in the conventional rules of how life should be organized. The canyon camp evolved from a hideout for outlaws into something closer to a settlement. Some of the men left, drifting away to other lives or other troubles. Others stayed and gradually began to develop a kind of loyalty to Jacob that went beyond fear and extended into genuine respect. Jacob slowly ceased his criminal activities, though he never fully abandoned the life he had lived. He was too well known, and there were too many people who wanted revenge against him, for him to ever truly disappear into a peaceful existence. But he stopped robbing stages. He stopped killing men. Instead, he used his wealth to maintain the canyon settlement and to purchase supplies that allowed his people to live in a state of cautious security. Rebecca became the heart of this community. She taught Sarah Ann to read and write, giving her daughter an education despite their isolated location. She created a space that could be called a home, decorating the cabin that she and Jacob built for themselves with items that brought beauty into their harsh environment. She nursed the men who were injured or ill. She mediated disputes between them when arguments arose. Gradually, her reputation spread beyond the immediate canyon. The Mexican traders who came through with supplies began to request her advice. Outlaws who had nowhere else to go began to view the canyon as a place where they might find refuge and something approaching human kindness. But the outside world did not forget about Jacob Wilcox. The law never entirely stopped looking for him. There were wanted posters with his face on them, though the images were often years old and poorly drawn. There were bounty hunters who occasionally appeared on the edges of the territory, asking questions about a man who looked like Jacob's description. Jacob was never captured, partly because he had men who were loyal to him and partly because he had paid off various officials to look the other way. But the constant threat of discovery hung over their lives like a storm cloud that never quite broke but never quite dissipated. Sarah Ann grew. By the time she was 10, she was becoming a beautiful girl with her mother's features and an intelligence that surpassed her years. Jacob paid for a tutor to come to the canyon during the summers, a schoolteacher from Prescott who had her own reasons for appreciating the generous payments she received and who was careful never to ask questions about her unusual employment. Sarah Ann learned mathematics and literature. She learned French and Spanish. She became fluent in 3 languages and could read better than most of the men in the canyon. Jacob's relationship with Sarah Ann changed as she grew older. He had never been a conventional father, but he became increasingly invested in her education and her future. He told Rebecca one night that he wanted better for Sarah Ann than the life of the territory. He wanted her to have the kind of future that a girl with her intelligence and beauty could legitimately achieve. He wanted her to go to a real school, to eventually go to a university if she wished, to have the kind of opportunities that were available to girls born into wealth and respectable families. Rebecca understood what this meant. It meant that Jacob was thinking about a future in which they could not remain in the canyon. It meant that he was considering what would happen to Sarah Ann when he could no longer protect her from the consequences of being the daughter of an outlaw. It meant that he was, in some profound way, accepting that redemption for himself might be impossible, but that he could perhaps achieve it for his daughter. The turning point came in the spring of 1893, 6 years after Rebecca had ridden into the canyon to offer herself to a man she did not know. A federal marshal arrived in Prescott with new information and new authorization to pursue Jacob Wilcox across the territory. The marshal was young and ambitious and very specifically interested in finally bringing in a man who had eluded capture for nearly 2 decades. Jacob's network of informants brought him word of this within days. Jacob called Rebecca and Sarah Ann to the cabin they shared, and he told them the truth. The time of their life in the canyon was coming to an end. It could end one of 3 ways. He could attempt to run, taking his family and starting again in another territory, always moving, always hiding. He could fight, making a stand against the authorities and almost certainly dying in the attempt, leaving Rebecca and Sarah Ann with nothing. Or he could arrange for his family to disappear while he remained in the territory to face the consequences of his past. Rebecca immediately rejected the third option. She told Jacob that she had not spent 6 years with him, had not built this life with him, had not learned to love him in this deep and complicated way, only to abandon him when the cost became too high. But Jacob was resolute. He told her that the life he had built was coming to an end because it had been built on a foundation that was fundamentally illegal and unstable. But Rebecca's life did not have to end. Sarah Ann's life did not have to end. What he proposed was this: Rebecca and Sarah Ann would leave the territory. He had contacts in California, men who owed him favors. He could arrange for them to be given new names, new identities, enough money to start over in San Francisco. Sarah Ann could go to a proper school. Rebecca could build a life that was not always lived in the shadow of a wanted man. And he would remain in the territory and would, sooner or later, face whatever justice awaited him. Rebecca spent 3 days refusing this plan. She argued with Jacob. She wept. She declared that she would not leave him, that she had promised to stay, that they were partners in this life. But Jacob was immovable. He told her that his love for her was precisely why he had to let her go. He told her that he had already taken enough from her, had already demanded enough sacrifice. He told her that Sarah Ann deserved a chance to become something more than the daughter of an outlaw. On the 4th day, Rebecca understood that she could not win this argument by refusal. So instead, she made a different kind of argument. She told Jacob that before she left, before she took Sarah Ann away from him forever, she wanted 1 more month with him. 1 more month where they would live as if the world outside the canyon did not exist. 1 more month where they would be a family without the shadow of the future hanging over them. Jacob agreed to this. That month was the most intense and the most painful month of Rebecca's life. She and Jacob and Sarah Ann lived together in the cabin, and, during the day, they pretended that nothing was changing. Jacob taught Sarah Ann about the constellations at night, pointing out the stars and telling her stories about the ancient people who had named them. Rebecca cooked meals that were Jacob's favorites. They took walks through the canyon, which was in full spring bloom, and Sarah Ann picked flowers while her mother and the man she had come to view as her father held hands and walked behind her. But, at night, when Sarah Ann was asleep, Rebecca and Jacob held each other and said goodbye in 100 different ways. They made love with a tenderness that spoke of their knowledge that this would not last. They talked about the person Rebecca would become in California. They talked about the school Sarah Ann would attend and the life she would live. They talked about whether Jacob believed in the possibility of an afterlife, a place where they might see each other again. Jacob said he did not believe in such things, but he hoped for them anyway. On the last day, Jacob gave Rebecca an envelope containing the names and addresses of his contacts in California, along with letters of introduction and a sum of money that was substantial enough to ensure that she and Sarah Ann would never go hungry. He gave Sarah Ann a gift that he had commissioned from a Mexican silversmith during the years they had lived together, a bracelet engraved with both his name and Rebecca's name and Sarah Ann's name. He told the child that as long as she wore the bracelet, she would carry all of them with her, no matter how far apart they became. Rebecca and Sarah Ann left the canyon at dawn on a morning in May. They rode in a covered wagon toward Prescott, and, from there, they would take a stagecoach toward California. Rebecca did not allow herself to look back at the canyon, though she desperately wanted to. She knew that if she looked back, if she saw Jacob standing at the edge of the camp watching them leave, she would not be able to continue forward. 18 months after leaving the canyon, Rebecca and Sarah Ann had settled into a new life in San Francisco. Rebecca, now known as Margaret Stevens, worked as a manager for a respectable boarding house. Sarah Ann, now known as Ann Stevens, attended a prestigious school for girls and was at the top of her class in every subject. Rebecca had built a life that was, on the surface, exactly what Jacob had wanted for her. It was respectable. It was safe. It was stable. But Sarah Ann would sometimes look at the bracelet on her wrist, the one engraved with names that belonged to people who no longer existed in any official sense, and she would ask her mother questions about the man she had known as her father. Rebecca would tell her stories about the canyon, and about a man who had been capable of great cruelty but who had also been capable of great love. She would tell her daughter that sometimes the most important people in our lives are people we are supposed to forget, but that we carry them inside us anyway, in the decisions we make and the people we become. Jacob Wilcox was captured by federal marshals in the fall of 1894. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to 20 years in a territorial prison. He did not attempt to escape. He served his sentence quietly, and he died in prison in 1903, having lived just long enough to learn that his daughter had graduated from her school with highest honors and had begun to study medicine, one of the few women in California to pursue such a path. Sarah Ann became a doctor. She dedicated her life to treating the poor and marginalized people of San Francisco, and she never forgot the canyon or the man who had made such a sacrifice for her future. She wore the silver bracelet every day of her life, and she told her own children the story of their grandmother's choice and their grandfather's redemption. Rebecca lived to be 84 years old.
In her final years, she would sometimes speak about the life she had lived in the territory, about the impossible choice she had made, and about the man she had loved. She never remarried. She never stopped wearing the wedding ring that Jacob had given her, a simple silver band that bore his initials and hers. And, long after she was gone, long after the territory had been transformed into states and modern cities, the story of Rebecca and Jacob would still be remembered in certain circles. It would be a story about what love could make a person willing to do. It would be a story about how redemption was sometimes possible, and sometimes it was not, but the attempt to achieve it was what mattered. It would be a story about how a mother's sacrifice could echo through generations, shaping not just her own life, but the lives of everyone who came after her, reminding them that the person we choose to become is more important than the circumstances we were born into.